All right, welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities with Chapter 2. I'd like to be able to do Chapter 2 in 2 reads, but unfortunately I think there's no good stopping point in the middle of this chapter, so we're going to break this up into 3 relatively short reads. Also, in this first read, there is going to be a sidebar, factors behind price differences. That's on the second to last page of this section that we're going to be reading today. I'm going to actually save that for the end of the read, so we'll come back to that when we get to the end of the read today. So without further ado, Chapter 2, Discrimination, Meanings and Costs. Some people are said to have discriminating tastes when they are especially discerning in detecting differences in qualities and choosing accordingly, whether choosing wines, paintings, or other goods and services. But the word is also used in an almost opposite sense to refer to arbitrary differences in behavior toward people, based on their group identities, regardless of their actual qualities as individuals. Both kinds of discrimination can result in large differences in outcomes, whether judging people or things. Wine connoisseurs can end up choosing one kind of wine far more often than another, and paying far more for a bottle of one kind of wine than for a bottle of the other. Something similar can often be observed when it comes to people. It is common in countries around the world for some groups to have very different outcomes when they are judged by others in employment, educational, and other contexts. Thus, different groups may end up with very different incomes, occupations, and unemployment rates, or very different rates of admissions to colleges and universities, among many other group disparities and outcomes. The fundamental question is, which kind of discrimination has led to such disparate outcomes? Have differences in qualities between individuals or groups been correctly discerned by others, or have those others made their decisions based on personal aversions or arbitrary assumptions about members of particular groups? This is ultimately an empirical question, even if attempts to answer that question evoke passionate feelings and passionate certainty by observers reaching opposite conclusions. Another way of saying the same thing is, are group disparities in outcomes a result of internal differences in behavior and capabilities accurately assessed by outsiders, or are those disparities due to external impositions based on the biased misjudgments or antagonisms of outsiders? The answers to such questions are not necessarily the same for all group disparities, nor necessarily the same for a given group at different times and places. Seeking the answers to such questions is more than an academic exercise, when the ultimate purpose is to enable more fellow human beings to have better prospects of advancing themselves. But before seeking answers, we need to be very clear about the words we use in asking the question. Meanings of discrimination. At a minimum, we need to know what we ourselves mean when we use a word like discrimination, especially since it has conflicting meanings. The broader meaning, an ability to discern differences in the qualities of people and things and choosing accordingly, can be called discrimination 1, making fact-based distinctions. The narrower but more commonly used meaning, treating people negatively based on arbitrary assumptions or aversions concerning individuals of a particular race or sex, for example, can be called discrimination 2, the kind of discrimination that has led to anti-discrimination laws and policies. Ideally, discrimination 1, applied to people, would mean judging each person as an individual, regardless of what group that person is a part of. But here, as in other contexts, the ideal is seldom found among human beings in the real world, even among people who espouse that ideal. If you are walking at night down a lonely street and see up ahead a shadowy figure in an alley, do you judge that person as an individual, or do you cross the street and pass to the other side? The shadowy figure in the alley could turn out to be a kindly neighbor, out walking his dog. But when making such decisions, a mistake on your part could be costly, up to and including costing you your life. In other contexts, you may in fact judge each person as an individual. But that depends on context. But But that this depends on context means that people have already been implicitly pre-sorted by the context, and only after that pre-sorting are they then judged as individuals. For example, a professor entering a classroom on the first day of the academic year may judge and treat each student as an individual. But that same professor walking down a lonely street at night may not judge and react to each stranger on the road ahead as an individual. The students in a college classroom are not likely to be a random sample of the full range of variations found in the general population, and are more likely to represent a narrower range of people assembled there for a narrower range of purposes, and with a narrower range of individual characteristics, as well as being in a setting less dangerous than a dark street at night. In short, one of the differences between the applicability of Discrimination 1 and Discrimination 2 is cost, and this is not always a small cost, nor a cost measured solely in money. Everyone might agree that making decisions based on Everyone might agree that Discrimination 1 is preferable, other things being equal, because it means making decisions based on demonstrable realities. Nevertheless, one may still be aware that other things are not always equal, and sometimes other things are very far from being equal. Where there is a difference in costs when choosing between Discrimination 1 and Discrimination 2, much may depend on how high those costs are, and especially on who pays those costs. People who never walk through a particular neighborhood at night, or perhaps not even in broad daylight, may nevertheless be indignant at banks that engage in redlining, that is, putting a whole neighborhood off limits as a place to invest their depositors' money. The observer's own redlining and their choices of where to walk may never be seen by them as a different example of the same principle. In short, Discrimination 1 can have prohibitive costs in some situations, especially when it is applied at the individual level. However, Discrimination 2, the arbitrary or antipathy-based bias against a group, is not the only other option. Another way of making decisions is by weighing empirical evidence about groups as a whole, or about the interactions of different groups with one another. This is still Discrimination 1, basing decisions on empirical evidence. But the distinction between the ideal version of Discrimination 1, judging each individual as an individual, and making decisions based on empirical evidence about the group to which the individual belongs, is a consequential difference. We can call the ideal version, being decisions based on evidence about individuals, Discrimination 1A, and the less than ideal version, basing individual decisions on group evidence, Discrimination 1B. Both are different from Discrimination 2, making decisions based on unsubstantiated notions or animosities. To take an extreme example of Discrimination 1B, for the sake of illustration, if 40% of the people in Group X are alcoholics, and 1% of the people in Group Y are alcoholics, an employer may well prefer to only hire people from Group Y for work where an alcoholic would be not only ineffective but dangerous. This would mean that a majority of the people in Group X, 60% in this case, would be denied the employment even though they are not alcoholics. What matters crucially to the employer is the cost of determining which individual is or is not an alcoholic when job applicants all show up sober on the day when they are seeking employment. This also matters to the customers who buy the employer's products and to society as a whole. If alcoholics produce a higher proportion of products that turn out to be defective, that is a cost to consumers, and that cost may take different forms. For example, the customer would buy the product and then discover that it is defective. Alternatively, defects in the product might be a discovery at the factory and discarded. In this case, the customers will be charged higher prices for the products that are sold, since the cost of defective products that are discovered and discarded at the factory must be covered by the prices charged for the reliable products that pass the screening test and are sold. To the extent that alcoholics are not only less competent but dangerous, The costs of those dangers are paid by either fellow employees who face those dangers on the job or by customers who buy dangerously defective products, or both. In short, these are serious costs inherent to the situation, so that either 60% of the people in Group X, or employers or customers, or all three groups end up paying the cost of the alcoholism of 40% of the people in Group X. This is certainly not judging each job applicant as an individual, so it is not discrimination 1 in the purest sense of discrimination of 1A. On the other hand, it is also not discrimination 2 in the sense of decisions based on a personal bias or antipathy toward the group. The employer might well have personal friends from Group X based on far more knowledge of those particular individuals than it is possible to get about job applicants, without prohibitive costs. The point here is neither to justify nor condemn the employer, but to classify different decision-making processes so that their implications and consequences can be analyzed separately. If judging each person as an individual is discrimination 1A, we can classify discrimination 1B, basing decisions about groups on information that is correct for that group, though not necessarily correct for every individual in that group, nor necessarily even correct for a majority of the individuals in that group. A real-life example of the cost of knowledge in this context is a study which shows that, despite the reluctance of many employers to hire young black males because a significant proportion of them have criminal records, discrimination 1B, those particular employers who automatically did criminal background checks on all their employees, discrimination 1A, tended to hire more young black males than did other employers. In other words, where the nature of the work made criminal background checks worth the cost for all employees, it was no longer necessary to use group information to assess whether individual young black job applicants had a criminal background. This made young black job applicants without a criminal background more employable than before. More is involved here than simply a question of nomenclature. It has implications for practical policies in the real world. Many observers, hoping to help young black males have more employment opportunities, have advocated prohibiting employers from asking job applicants questions about a criminal record. Moreover, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has sued employers who do criminal background checks on job applicants on grounds that this was racial discrimination, even when it was applied to all job applicants regardless of race. Empirically, however, criminal background checks provide more employment opportunities for young black males. In a very different situation, even employers who have no animosity or aversions against particular groups may nevertheless engage in discrimination 1B, empirically based generalizations, when the employer knows that various groups react differently in the presence of some other group or groups. Back in 19th century America, for example, when there were many immigrants from Europe in the workforce, some groups brought their mutual antagonisms in Europe with them to America. To have a workforce including both Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics working together at the time was to risk distracting frictions and even violence with negative effects on productivity. In other words, a workforce consisting exclusively of either group might be more efficient than a workforce consisting of both. The same principle applies where different groups have especially positive reactions to one another. For example, the employer may be indifferent as to whether the work to be done is done by men or women, and yet be well aware that men and women are not indifferent to each other, or else the human race would have become extinct long ago. Therefore, in the interests of workforce efficiency, when a particular occupation is overwhelmingly chosen by women, such as nursing, the employer may be reluctant to hire a male nurse, regardless of that male nurse's individual qualifications. Conversely, where lumberjacks are overwhelmingly male, the employer may be reluctant to hire a female lumberjack, even if she is demonstrably as fully qualified as the men. Observers who point out that particular individuals are equally qualified, regardless of sex, miss the point. An equally qualified individual may do the work just as well as others, but if some of the others are distracted from their work, the net effect can be a less efficient workforce. This is the empirical basis that can lead employers to practice discrimination 1B in such situations, even if the employers have no bias or aversion to those less likely to be hired. Misdiagnosing the basis for discrimination produces more than a difference in words. It can produce policies less likely to achieve their goals, or even policies that make matters worse, as in the case of forbidding employers from checking criminal background records of job applicants. Moreover, higher costs are not just a problem limited to employers. Others are going to have to pay their higher costs that initially fall on employers if those employers are to stay in business and continue to provide jobs. Many people do not like to hear economists say that there is no free lunch, but that does not change the reality. Employment decisions are not the only decisions affected by discrimination of one sort or another. Where there are real differences between groups with potentially dire consequences, such as murder rates several times higher in one group than another, discrimination 1B may be carried to the point of redlining a whole neighborhood or group, even when a majority of the group avoided are not guilty of the behavior feared. Even in a high-crime neighborhood, for example, most people are not necessarily criminals, but the costs of sorting the local population individually can be prohibitively high. Therefore, decisions are likely to be made through a cruder decision-making process, relying on empirically based generalizations, discrimination 1B, rather than the more discerning but costly discrimination 1A, or an antipathy-based or bias-based discrimination 2. One of the consequences of such situations is that a law-abiding majority in a high-crime neighborhood can end up paying a high price for the presence of a criminal minority in their midst. Some businesses will not deliver their products, whether pizzas or furniture, to high-crime neighborhoods rather than risk bodily harm, including death, to their drivers. Taxi drivers may avoid taking passengers to such neighborhoods for the same reason, even when these are black taxi drivers refusing to go into black high-crime neighborhoods, especially at night. Supermarket chains and other businesses often avoid locating stores in such neighborhoods for similar reasons. All this hurts law-abiding people in high-crime neighborhoods who are, in effect, paying a price for what other people are doing. In addition to being the principal victims of criminals in their midst, they also literally pay a price in hard cash for the behavior of others, and the higher prices usually charged for goods sold in neighborhoods where there are higher costs of doing business due to higher levels of shoplifting, vandalism, burglary, pilferage, and robbery, and higher business insurance premiums because of these and other neighborhood disorders. A study titled "The Poor Pay More" saw the poor in general as exploited consumers, taken advantage of by stores located in low-income neighborhoods. This view was echoed in the media, in government, and in academic publications. Yet because many low-income neighborhoods are also high-crime neighborhoods, the poor pay more committed an all too common error in assuming that the cause of some undesirable outcome can be determined by where the statistical data were collected. In this case, researchers collected price data in the neighborhood stores. But the causes of those high prices were not the people who posted those prices in the stores. Moreover, while prices were higher in inner-city, low-income neighborhood stores, rates of profit on investment in such stores were not higher than average, but lower than average, despite some people who assumed that profit rates had to be higher because of the higher prices. For people unaware of the economics of the situation, the higher prices may be seen as simply price gouging by greedy store owners, discrimination too against minority neighborhoods, and a problem that the government could solve by imposing price controls, for example, as a Harlem newspaper suggested during the 1960s furor over revelations that the poor pay more. If, however, businesses in these neighborhoods do not recover their higher costs of doing business there in the prices they charge, they face the prospect of being forced out of business by losses. There is often a dearth of businesses in low-income, high-crime neighborhoods, which would hardly be the case if there were higher rates of profit being made from the higher prices charged in such neighborhoods. It may be no consolation to those law-abiding citizens in a high-crime neighborhood that the higher prices they have to pay are reimbursing higher costs of doing business where they live. Meanwhile, politicians and local activists have every incentive to claim that the higher prices are due to discrimination, in the sense of discrimination too, even when in fact the community is simply paying additional costs generated by some residents in that community. Those local residents who created none of those costs may be victims of those who did, rather than being victims of those who charged the resulting higher prices. This is not just an abstract philosophical point or a matter of semantics. The difference between understanding the source of the higher prices and mistakenly blaming those who charge those prices, which is especially likely when most of the local businesses are owned by people who are ethnically different from the people living in the neighborhood, is the difference between doing things to lessen the problem and doing things likely to make the problem worse by driving more much-needed businesses out of the neighborhood. Although higher prices in low-income neighborhoods are often discussed in the context of racial or ethnic minorities, the same economic consequences have been found where the people in low-income neighborhoods are white. As the Cincinnati Enquirer reported, residents of Eastern Kentucky refer to the higher prices and interest rates common in their area as the hillbilly tax, end quote. Among the things that might be done to reduce the burden of unfairness to law-abiding residents of high-crime neighborhoods could be stronger law enforcement by the police and the courts. But to the extent that the public, both inside and outside of the affected communities, sees the high prices as discrimination too against the affected community as a whole, due to bias or antipathy about by the larger society, the imposition of stronger law enforcement could be seen as just another imposition of injustice on the affected communities. In short, whether people believe that higher prices in low-income, high-crime neighborhoods are due to discrimination 2, or to empirically based decisions, discrimination 1, matters in terms of which policies to reduce the unfair burdens in law-abiding residents are politically feasible. Community or ethnic solidarity can be a major obstacle to seeing, believing, or responding to the facts. This is where Sowell inserts a sidebar, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. None of this tells us how much discrimination 1 or discrimination 2 exists in a given society, or how many disparities in outcomes are due to some other circumstances or some other decision-making process. In some situations, there may clearly be costs deliberately imposed on a group by outsiders, discrimination 2, such as denying Black American citizens the right to vote in many southern states in times past. The racial segregation laws in those states, forcing Black passengers to sit in the back of buses and trolleys, and denying them admissions to those state universities set aside for whites only, were obvious examples of clearly racial discrimination. The original ghettos in centuries past, which forced Jews to live in a confined area and banned them from most European universities, were other examples of the same discrimination too. Innumerable other groups in the countries of the world, around the world, the untouchables in India being a classic example, faced even more and worse restrictions and oppressions. These are all costs imposed by discrimination too, and paid for by its victims. What also warrants analysis in order to understand cause and effect are the costs paid by the discriminators, because these costs are factors in how much discrimination too can persist in particular circumstances and institutions. Such costs have no such moral, political, or ideological attractions as the costs paid by victims, but the costs that discriminators have to pay, and the circumstances in which they do or do not have to pay those costs, can affect how much discrimination too is in fact likely to be inflicted. Understanding the costs paid by discriminators also presents opportunities for policies that can ensure that these costs cannot be evaded, as well as warnings that other policies may inadvertently free discriminators from these costs if the circumstances are not understood. Okay, so that ends that section. We will return back to the sidebar here. Sidebar: factors behind price differences. Crime is not the only reason why prices are higher in many low-income neighborhoods. To someone unfamiliar with economics, it may seem strange that a store in a low-income neighborhood can be struggling to survive while selling a product for $1 that Walmart is getting rich selling for 75 cents. But the costs of running a business are among the many things that are neither equal nor random. Walmart's costs are lower in many ways, of which safer locations are just one. Even if a local store charging $1 is making 15 cents gross profit per item, while Walmart is making only 10 cents, if Walmart's inventory turnover rate is 3 times as high, then in a given time period, Walmart is making 30 cents selling that item, while the local store owner is making 15 cents. Walmart's inventory turnover rate is in fact higher than that of even some other big box chain stores, and much higher than that of a local neighborhood store, where the same item may sit on the shelf much longer before being sold. Delivery costs are also likely to be lower per item delivered to a Walmart store. For example, the cost of delivering 100 boxes of cereal to one giant Walmart store may be far lower than the cost of delivering 10 boxes of cereal to each of 10 different neighborhood stores scattered around the city. It is 100 boxes of cereal in either case, but the cost of delivering them can be very different. All right, so that concludes today's read. We will continue with Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell with the second read in Chapter 2 with the subsection Costs of Discrimination. So until then, this has been Mike from Mike Reads, signing off.